Hello, everyone. This is William with the third section of the long diary entry of 11th September 1907. And Dimitri's 16 years old. He's in the Crimea. And this is actually the penultimate section of this diary entry. So there will be one final one. There actually maybe two final ones, so maybe this isn't the penultimate. As I said, it's a very long diary entry, but we are nearing the end. This time we have some further interesting news about Dimitri's attire, and he receives his first military rank, his first authentic, you could say, military rank. And we find out more about life in the Crimea. And one of the most important things we find out is that, as I suspected, he and Maria are indeed staying at the Yusupov Palace in the Crimea, because neither Dimitri's father nor Uncle Sergei and Aunt Ella had Crimean estates. But Ella was very close with Princess Yusupova, the mother of the famous Felix Yusupov the Younger, who would be Dimitri's co-conspirator in the Rasputin assassination. And so when she went to the Crimea, she stayed on the Yusupov estate. And so that's where she has basically dropped Dimitri and Maria off there and gone off somewhere else. And I meant to look it up, but I forgot. But it appears that young Felix the Younger, is actually not there in residence. He is in probably England, probably Oxford, I would guess. But next year, in 1908, when Dimitri and Ella, without Maria, who was then married, returned to the Crimea and returned to the Yusupov estate, young Felix will be there. But that lies in the future. Today, we have another boy or young man whom Dimitri will talk about. Okay, so, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation of some of the estates and resort towns in the Crimea, because there's a whole list of them. All right, here we go. And now I have replaced the disgusting And now I have replaced the disgusting shoulder straps on the tunics I wear when I'm riding with real cornet's shoulder straps, which I will keep. I will arrive in Moscow completely different from how I was when I left. Victor will have to remove not my winter coat from Drus, but my sword and military greatcoat from Nordenstrom. Even here, Tjotja brought 2 wounded soldiers and put them in a lupka in rented rooms. These soldiers are only suffering here and not getting better at all. When we take the road to Alupka, we always greet them. I just love the countryside around Koreis. Alupka, Miskor, Simeis, Dulber, which is right under our noses, Chair or Chair, Orianda, Aitudor, Harax, Livadia, Yalta, and Massandra. I know all of those, one could say, personally. The high and low roads, which I had only seen in photographs, are now very familiar. We visit Aitudor and Harax, even for dinner, lunch, and tea, spending time with our aunts and uncles. I was visiting Harax fairly often, but now, thank God, that won't be happening anymore, because Sergei, that stupid resident of Chair, has departed, taking his rudeness away with him. Okay, lots to talk about here, beginning with Dimitri's attire. He apparently had shoulder straps that didn't have a particular rank, or maybe they were even in NCO's shoulder straps. He doesn't tell us, but he found it disgusting to have to wear them. Uh-oh. There go the dogs. Okay. And now he's wearing real cornet's shoulder straps. So cornet was the lowest officer's rank in the cavalry. And oddly enough, Dimitri would remain a cornet until the war broke out. So that really surprised me when I found out about it. And the ranks had slowed down. The ascension through the ranks had slowed down to an incredible degree between the previous generation and Dimitri's generation, although actually there had been a gradual slowing down. So it used to be that you were a general from the time you were a small child, if you were a member of the imperial family. And then as a professional consciousness began to take hold within the Russian military and during the era of great reforms, that was slowed way down so that the rank held by Grand Dukes was more or less an accurate reflection of what they were doing in their regiments or other units. So anyway, Dimitri will have those cornet shoulder straps for a while. But at the moment, at least, he's quite happy with them. So he is looking forward to arriving in Moscow next time. If you recall from the last section of this diary entry, he had noted that Nicholas had now told him that he would be wearing, instead of whatever boys' clothes he was wearing, non-military boys' clothes, he would now be wearing, when he was outside of Tsarskoye Selo, where he wore the uniform of the 2nd Guards Rifle Battalion, he would actually be wearing the uniform of his own regiment to be the Horse Guards. And so he had left Moscow at some point, probably around May, which is when the family seemed to go to Peterhof. And so now when he returns to Moscow with Ella, he's looking forward to the fact that this person who was apparently one of his valets, we don't know if Victor had gone with him to the Crimea or if he'd remained behind in Moscow for some reason. There was one previous reference to Victor in a 1906 diary entry in Tsarskoye Selo, where a pet, a dog or a cat, had gone missing, and Victor had found it at the other end of the palace. But anyway, Dimitri is very much looking forward to the moment when Victor will be removing his boy's winter coat, which he got from a tailor's shop called Drus, D-R-U-S, Drus, probably actually not a Russian name. Maybe even the English name Drew, and the shop was called Drus. But now Victor will be removing his sword and military greatcoat, which comes from the tailor's Nordenstrom. That sounds Swedish, and I remember that name because a couple of years ago I translated an article for Sovereign magazine about where Nicholas II and Alexei, where they got their clothing. And I believe it was from this same place. So this was where fashionable people, aristocrats, and royalty, the men, got their uniforms. And I forgot to mention yesterday that Alexei donned military uniform before Dimitri did, several years before Dimitri did, talking about age, not the chronological year. but that was because of the outbreak of the war. So he wasn't yet. So then, apparently, judging by Dmitri, one would don permanently one's military uniform, even at home, um, when one turned 16. But in Alexis's case, that was earlier because of the outbreak of war and him accompanying his father to headquarters beginning in 1915. Okay, frustration. Tiotia, Aunt Ella, has brought two of her wounded soldiers to the Crimea and left them there in rented rooms in a resort city or town called Alupka. And so when he's out riding with Maria and whoever else goes with them, and they pass through Alupka, they always greet these soldiers. He actually uses a verb that means to bow and says that they bow to them, but I'm assuming they didn't literally get off their horses and bow. Maybe they nodded their heads, I don't know, but they greeted them in some way. But Dmitri is saying that this was a bad decision on Ella's part because these soldiers are only suffering here and they're not getting better. Well, we don't know what kind of wounds they have. There were TB sanatoriums in the Crimea, and that's basically where you went if you didn't have the money or the inclination to go abroad, to go to Switzerland. You went to the Crimea, one of the sanatoriums there. So maybe these soldiers had tuberculosis, or it was feared that they had incipient tuberculosis, but they weren't sent to a sanatorium. They were put in rented rooms in Alupka. And why are they suffering? I mean, that sounds great, right? If you take a look at these Crimean resort towns, I mean, they're still resort towns and spa towns. They're just gorgeous. They're just beautiful. So why Dmitri thinks the soldiers are suffering, I don't know. But he's just in general frustrated with Ella about her activities with the soldiers that are her main focus. But anyway, he seems to be expressing compassion for them. So whether it's because primarily of his frustration with Ella, or if it's because he genuinely is observing them and seeing that they're not happy, I don't know. But okay, let's see, moving on. No, before we move on, I wanted to mention I was talking in the 1921 video series about Dimitri's connection to the peasantry and how deeply that would run, because he's talking about, in that diary entry of 31st January 1921, he's talking about gathering intelligence from he wasn't there in person, obviously, in Russia doing it, but gathering intelligence about the soldiers in the Red Army and also about the narod, the folk, the peasantry in general, and what their mood was and how they felt now, 3 years after the revolution, or 2.5 years after the revolution. Well, there were 2 revolutions. Anyway, not important. How they felt about the Soviet regime and the Bolshevik regime. And so I raised the question of what his connection to the peasantry had been. And one thing that I overlooked when I was discussing that was that he had this connection through Ella with the soldiers, most of whom would have come from the peasantry. I mean, at the time of the revolution, the Russian population was over 90% peasant, if you can imagine. So the soldiers would mostly have been drawn from the peasantry. And, I'd forgotten about that he was in close proximity, at least, if not contact, with these men, as long as he was living with Ella, and that as you recall, when he was at Ilinskaya, he was actually spending time, apparently voluntarily, with some of the soldiers that were there. There were 28 soldiers at Ilinskaya, and he wounded soldiers who were being rehabilitated, and he was weaving with them. That was a handicraft that they were being taught, and Dmitri was joining them and weaving with them. But so, he did maybe have a more of a connection with the peasants than the typical Romanov or aristocrat would have had, although all of them would have been in proximity to peasants if they spent any time at all on country estates. Okay, well, that was a digression. So now we have this list of places that he just loves, and who can blame him? Because, as I said, if you look at photographs of these places, they're gorgeous, these spa towns. So let's go through the list. Well, the tip-off that he and Maria are staying at the Yusupov estate is the reference to getting to know the countryside around Koreiz. So there's this long strip, north-south strip along the coast of the Black Sea, where you have all these little spa towns, only a few miles away from each other. Well, a few, I don't know, but within range of the rides that Dmitri and Maria are taking on horseback. So Alupka, we've mentioned. Alupka was and is known for the Vorontsov Palace, so a palace that belonged to one of the very prominent and wealthy Russian aristocratic families, Vorontsov. And then there's Miskhor, and I couldn't find anything about there being a palace in Miskhor. And I forgot when I was reading the diary entry that Dmitri adds in parentheses new, so new Miskhor. So I don't know what that is all about. Simeiz, I do not know how to pronounce these names, was not associated, as far as I can see, with any Romanov estates. Dyulber was the estate of Grand Duke Pyotr Nikolaevich, Nicholas Nikolaevich's brother, Nikolash's brother. And it seems that when Nicholasha went to the Crimea, he stayed at his brother's palace. It belonged to Pyotr Nikolaevich, but it seems to have been more or less shared between the two brothers, and that is where they would be staying after the revolution. They would retreat to this estate in the Crimea, and they would be evacuated from there. Okay, and Dmitri says it's right under our noses, so very close. So then we have Chair, and that one does not seem to have, again, a Romanov estate within its boundaries. So Oryanda had an estate that belonged to Nicholas I, and it was passed on to his son, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, who was Dmitri's great-grandfather, and he was more or less exiled to that estate by Alexander III. Konstantin Nikolaevich was a man of very liberal ideas, and probably the main instigator, more so than Alexander II, of the Great Reforms. And so naturally he didn't see eye to eye with Alexander III, and Alexander III more or less banished him to this Crimean estate that he had of Oryanda. So Aitador, any of you who are Romanov aficionados will recognize that name. That was the estate of Sandro, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, and his wife, Grand Duchess Ksenia. And let's see, Harax was the estate that belonged to Grand Duke Georgy Mikhailovich and his wife, who Dmitri called Aunt Minnie, and it was Yeah, his biological aunt. So he has a strong connection there. And it was also the estate. Well, Minnie was also the grandmother of my friend and mentor, David Chavchavadze, who's now passed away, unfortunately. And so I heard a lot about that one. You know, David was never there when it was actually Romanov property, but he did have a chance to visit as an adult after the end of the Soviet Union, and he was wildly enthusiastic about the place and talked about it a lot. And the fact that you could find ancient Greek artifacts there, coins and things like that. So Levadia is synonymous with the name of the palace that Nicholas II had built there for his family, although I think that wouldn't be built until 1911, but there was another palace there. But Levadia was where Nicholas and Alexandra and their children stayed, and I believe it was within the boundaries of Yalta, and it was famously where the conference took place between Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Stalin. Okay, Messandra. Yeah, I guess Alexander III had an estate in Messandra, and you can see the picture of the palace online, and it's just beautiful. But I think Alexander III also stayed in Levadia. I'm not sure about that. Okay, so previously Dmitri had only seen photographs. And this is, you know, another point indicating the fact that he and Maria and Sergei and Ella, I guess that's a cross between Olga and Elga. Okay, but anyway, Sergei and Ella had been fairly isolated from the rest of the family. I mean, probably, at least in part, because Sergei was so disliked by the rest of the family, with a few exceptions. And also because he was one of the more active Grand Dukes. He was playing an important part in the government as Governor General of Moscow. And when they had their summer holidays, they went to Ilinskaya and not to the Crimea. All right, so it's not surprising at all that Dmitri is visiting Aitodor and Harax. Nicholas or Sandro and Ksenia were there at Aitodor, and Ksenia seemed to have a soft spot in her heart for Dmitri and vice versa. Harax, of course, was where Dmitri's biological aunt was. And then there's this odd statement about Sergei. Sergei, that stupid resident of Chair, has departed, taking his rudeness away with him. But unless in some way I have misunderstood, although the language seems perfectly clear, the reason Dmitri was visiting Harax was because Sergei was there, even though he was a resident of Chair, as Dmitri puts it. So who was Sergei? Sergei was the future Duke of Leuchtenberg. So he was a little bit over a year older than Dmitri. So they were really, basically the same age. And I'm sure people were thinking, oh, this is ideal. These two boys can spend time together. Young Felix Yusupov wasn't there. They're both members of the imperial family, and in fact, Sergei had been born in Peterhof in 1890, July 1890, so just a year and a couple months older than Dmitri. And so why not bring these two boys together? Well, we know from past diary entries that Dmitri wasn't that wild. about being with around children or even around boys of his own age. He didn't take to that in a big way, maybe because he wasn't used to it, but he finds Sergei Georgievich to be rude. Okay, that's a word he uses a lot for people whom he does not like. So Sergei Georgievich would become the 8th Duke of Leuchtenberg only in 1942 when his older half-brother died. And there are some interesting things about him. One of them being that he was the son of the infamous Stana, the Princess Anastasia of Montenegro, one of the two Montenegrin sisters, the Black Sisters, I think they called them. Can't remember why, but they were the daughters of King Peter of Montenegro, and they both married Grand Dukes. So Stana, as she was called, her first husband was the 6th Duke of Leuchtenberg, but then she divorced him to marry Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, and her sister Militsa married Nikolash's brother Pyotr Nikolaevich, if that's not too confusing. So both of them became Grand Duchesses, and the date of that divorce is very interesting. So they were divorced, Stana and her husband, the Duke of Leuchtenberg, were divorced in 1906, and this is 1907. So poor Sergei is dealing with the fact that his mother has recently divorced and married a Grand Duke. So now Nicolasha was his stepfather. Stana and Nicolasha never had any children of their own. But I'm thinking, maybe this divorce was part of the reason why why Sergei maybe wasn't the most pleasant companion for Dmitri at that time. He had to deal with that in his own way. And so the two boys were not getting along. Okay, did I mention already that the Dukes of Leuchtenberg were descendants on the female side of Nicholas I, and they seem to have been very Russified, just like the Dukes of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. They were born and raised in Russia. And yeah, after the revolution, Dmitri would not have, to the extent that I can tell from his diaries and letters, which of course are intermittent, he did not have anything further to do with Sergei Georgievich, even though Sergei Georgievich would live till 1974. The person that he did have connection with was Sergei's older half-brother. The older half-brother was 9 years older than Sergei, and his name was Alexander, and he inherited the dukedom from his father, so he became the 7th Duke of Leuchtenberg, and Sergei would only become the Duke after this elder half-brother died. But in 1942, Alexander, the elder half-brother, died in 1942, the same year as Dmitri, and interestingly enough, Dmitri really met up with him and really got to know him for the first time when both of them were in Davos in 1939. Alexander was a patient at Guardaval Sanatorium, which was a sanatorium that specialized in tuberculosis of the eyes. So tuberculosis can spread or appear in almost any part of the human body, just like cancer. And so poor Alexander had it in his eyes and was at Guardaval Sanatorium, and he would come up to Schatzalp. I think, 2 or 3 times he came up to Schatzalp to visit Dmitri there. And Dmitri quite liked him, but it's clear that they didn't really know each other. so they got to a chance to get to know each other a little, and so yeah, so Alexander does appear in the adult diaries even earlier, although just in passing, but Sergei does not. All right, I've gone almost a half an hour. Maybe I did too big of a section of this diary entry, but come back. The remaining diary entries for the 11th of September 1907 are again very interesting. And we learn some new things about Dmitri and something very surprising. He's enjoying himself in the Crimea, but we find out something very surprising about where he wishes he was. I was surprised at any rate. So I will see you next time. Bye.